Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the KPMG Nunwood webinar on customer experience best practice in the utilities sector. So the exam question we're seeking to address today is that there's a huge amount of work going on across the utility sector to improve the quality of the customer experience. But in our 2014 survey of customer experience excellence, the utility sector continued to decline in terms of the quality of experience by 4 points. So the question is, how do we move the dial? What is it that we need to do? What needs to happen before we start to see an improvement in the key indicators across the sector? So answering that question today, and accompanying myself, is Chris Nutt from KPMG Nunwood. Chris is the author of a much-downloaded white paper on the utility sector, and he'll provide a quick analysis of the forces at play in the utility sector. Hello, Chris.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Also with me today is David Gascoigne, who leads the Power and Utilities Group at KPMG. And David will start to address the key drivers of the future direction of the sector. Hello, David.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's get on with the meat of the day. The information and the insight that we're going to share with you today comes from the Customer Experience Excellence Centre. Many of you may be aware of the centre, what it is and what it does, but it represents some 5 years of research into customer perceptions of the quality of the experiences that they have with something like 260 organisations across the UK. We run the surveys globally, so we also assess customer experience in the US and in APAC. And essentially, we run the surveys primarily to answer 4 questions. So the first is, what does a customer experience look like when it's great or when it's excellent from a customer's perspective? Who in the world excels at delivering experiences to customers? What do they do? And then finally, how do they do it so that we are able to codify what they do and make that available to organizations that want to learn from those businesses that do great things in the field of customer experience. So that survey has been running for some 5 years and now has about 900 brands globally with well over 1.25 million customer evaluations. And that data drives a number of different aspects of the KPMG Nunwood business. So, as a result of all of that data and our desire to codify what best practice looks like, we've identified what we call the 6 pillars, 6 themes. And many of you may well be aware of these 6 themes, and many organizations are beginning to adopt them as their internal mechanism for driving the quality of the customer experience. But we're going to spend a little time looking at these as we go through the presentation and understanding how they operate within the area of utilities. So the first of those is personalization, so the degree to which the experience can be made to feel unique to the individual, so recognizes their personal circumstances and ensures that the experience is adapted to meet those circumstances. The next one is time and effort, so the amount of time and the amount of effort, whether that's cognitive, physical, transactional, whatever it might be, that the customer needs to make to achieve an objective with the organization. And what is it that the customer feels is a return on their time? So to achieve an objective, how do they feel that they've been rewarded at the end of that for the time they've invested? Next one is resolution, so being able to turn a poor experience into a great one. So in the field of customer experience, there's something called the service paradox, or the service recovery paradox, which is if you're able to make a poor experience into a great one, the customer may often feel better about you as an organization than they did before something went wrong in the first place. Next one's expectations, so our ability to manage, meet, and exceed customer expectations, and typically that takes 2 dimensions. So at the highest level, it's the brand promise, so the expectation that's set by the organization and communicated as part of the brand. But at the lower, more transactional level, it's what happens on a day-to-day basis, and what promises are set and how well are those kept. Integrity. Integrity operates at multiple levels. So integrity being what the organization stands for, more than just making profit for shareholders. And we're going to explore integrity in some detail today, given the nature of the reputational concerns within the industry. But also the competence of the organization, its ability to do what it says it can do. And then finally, again, its ability to keep the commitments that it makes to its customers that then engender trust. And then finally, empathy, which is the ability of the business to put itself in the shoes of the customer and choose the right emotional response, have the emotional intelligence to deal with the customer in exactly the right way that the customer needs, given their sort of personal circumstances. Now, we know from the analysis that we've done that these 6 factors make a very big difference to organizations commercially when they start to get them right. And the regression analysis that we have done shows that broadly the explanatory power of these 6 pillars is around 66%. So they explain 2/3 of the outcome of either advocacy or loyalty. And we know that organizations need to get all 6 of them right, so you can't kind of pick them off necessarily, although there is a logical sequence, as we shall see, in terms of implementation. But broadly, if you look at the principle that, or the pillar that has the biggest impact, you'll see that personalization at 23% seems to outweigh the others. However, as you'll see, personalization is one of the things that you might choose to do a little later down the priority order. Okay, so that's the sort of the backdrop to it all. And in terms of today's agenda, 3 areas that we're going to look at. So the first is that Chris is going to talk to us around the current state of the utilities market. I'm then going to talk a little bit about best practice, and in particular share a case study with you from Florida Power and Light, who actually came 36th in our US survey, and I think there's a lot that we might learn in the UK from what they have done. And then finally, David's going to talk a little bit about the future and the sort of drivers of the utility sector. So let me hand over now to Chris, who's going to talk to you about the current state of the utilities market.
Thank you, David. I'm going to start with this slide, and those of you familiar with the output from the 2014 UK study that the Customer Experience Excellence Centre produced may recognise this. It's an illustration of the 260 or so brands in the study relative to each other and categorised in terms of customer perceptions of experience excellence. From those that we term champion brands, the top 10 tier in consumers' eyes, to those we term latecomers or drifters at the opposite end of the spectrum. And the shape of the curve is interesting in a number of ways, in that it suggests that those market-leading brands in the top 10 are those who've specifically sought to invest in experience excellence as a key business driver and are achieving levels of differentiation over and above the average in the pack, if you like, many of whom are still delivering great experiences but may not be either achieving the same level of consistency or possibly the same level of emotional pitch that the top 10 brands seem to generate on a reliable, consistent basis. The perhaps not surprising conclusion is the grouping of energy and utility brands at the lower end of the study findings. And notwithstanding the observation that in many ways energy consumption is a distressed purchase in itself, it lacks the theatre of often more glamorous products and services in other sectors. Buying an iPad is a lot more fun than paying your electricity bill, let's face it. Nevertheless, in terms of the ability to satisfy a service-orientated need from consumers generally, it suggests that the main players in the sector have some significant way to go. Now, that may not be earth-shattering news, but if we look at the US marketplace in our latest report into customer experience excellence, which we published in March of this year, we see a markedly different picture. In the UK, new customer experiences in the sector are generally quite positive, but when we look at latter phases of the customer journey, where lower levels of brand affiliation can be magnified by disrupted journeys, queries, less effective communication strategies and operations on the part of those interactions with consumers, then we see an effect which is summarized here in the marked difference between the way US energy companies seem to perform against the same benchmark and the six-pillar model that we apply in both markets. It seems when we look in detail at the verbatim and other aspects of the results that US energy consumers particularly comment on the ability of service providers to turn an issue into a positive customer experience and deliver greater levels of consistency in support and service in the later stages of the customer journey or life cycle, very much resolution being a strong pillar of their overall capability. Now, these observations aren't really taking place in a static market, of course. The continuing role of price comparison providers, review sites, microgeneration and the smart energy program are all forces for disruption in the market, together with increased regulatory intervention, which shows little sign of let-up. This week we saw the Competition and Markets Authority headline on overcharging, and a special focus on SMEs, actually, in that report, as opposed to domestic consumers. Now, when you couple that with innovations in collective switching, the accelerating impact of technology in a range of ways, the Internet of Things, where smart, digitally collected homes, transport systems, cities are demonstrating the potential to change the whole fabric of the supply chain more generally, then the scene is set for both threat and opportunity to the industry. Threat because these changes add up to more informed and more empowered consumers. They have data and information and assets that wouldn't have existed to them, wouldn't have existed in a pre-digital age. So they have more choice and a louder voice through social media and other digital channels to express their preferences. An opportunity because these changes fundamentally change the nature of the relationship between producers and consumers to one of being an information-based relationship. And what I mean by that is illustrated here in the sense that, in the words, well, if we take the words of the World Economic Forum, information is the new oil. So we're moving from one energy asset to another. Old world business strategies very much relied on brands knowing which of these three value disciplines that they should focus on. They were either product leaders like an Apple, they were operationally efficient like a Walmart, or they were essentially like customer intimacy, and an example from another sector being First Direct that leads the UK study in this regard. But because of these changing forces taking place in the marketplace, they have the potential to make the nature of the relationship between suppliers and consumers a much richer, more intimate, information-based relationship. And insofar as that's the case, the ability of brands to leverage those relationships is becoming much more significant. The customer intimacy value discipline, if you like, can no longer be peripheral. It's becoming central to the core business proposition of many consumer-facing brands. Customer intimacy is becoming more essential in the digital market. And this leads to the question, what can brands do to move the dial, to engage and entice their customers through superior experiences that take account of the best practices that are out there and that we're observing in the Customer Experience Excellence Centre? And that is what we're going to talk about next. So I'll hand back to David to cover that.
Thank you, Chris. So one of the things that we often say about the Customer Experience Excellence Centre is that whatever problem you're grappling with, whatever issue it is that you're seeking to deal with, someone somewhere in the world has grappled with it before. And therefore, one of the benefits of the centre is finding out who in the world has actually had to deal with this problem, what have they done to resolve it. So we're going to look at a number of companies that have been through the process very quickly and identify what it is that they have done. And then we're going to focus on Florida Power and Light, who have gone through a sort of a 9-year transformation program, which we think will be very insightful. So what we look for particularly each year that the results come out is which organizations have moved the most. So we're interested, obviously, at those that come at the top of our league tables, but what organizations have moved more quickly. And then we're really interested in what it is that they have done. And often we find that actually what they have done has taken a number of years of effort, but suddenly it culminates in a change in the quality of the experience that's perceived across the board by the customer. So if we look at organizations like Prudential, dealing with the issues around reputation that came out of pensions mis-selling in the sort of early 90s, Prudential embarked on a transformation, a 1,000-day plan that was designed to move their organization forward very, very quickly. It's taken them the best part of 10 years for that to come to fruition. And in fact, this year they moved 146 places in our league table. Nationwide showed that you can do it a little bit more quickly. They've moved sort of 86 places in our table over the best part of sort of 5 years, but made a huge jump in the first 2 years, putting 23 points on their customer satisfaction survey by thinking about the way in which they treat customers and the way in which they deal with resolution. Britannia, as an organization, it took them 5 years to make a significant change in the quality of the experience. Florida Power and Light we're going to look at in a bit more detail. Air New Zealand is interesting because in 2005 they were within minutes of going out of business when the New Zealand government refused to continue their subsidy. But they have completely transformed their organization, and over the last 10 years have now positioned themselves as one of the leading providers of air travel around the world with an outstanding customer experience. Saga, I think it says on the slide, took 93 years, but actually I think that's a bracket that's gone slightly adrift. So Saga have made a significant improvement in 3 years. QVC, and took them 6 years. And then Butlins, who are suffering a little bit from a view of sort of the 1960s perspective on holiday camps, it took them 9 years to make a big difference. And they jumped the best part of 90 places in the year before last survey. So what's interesting about these organizations is the process that they've been through and the sequence within which they've addressed things. And there's 3 clear phases of activity that these businesses have been through. So the first of those is removing detractors, so removing the reasons why customers will be upset with you. Some of that is around repairing the basic infrastructure. If you don't have to do that, you can move more quickly. So Nationwide, who I talked about before, who moved within 2 years, had invested heavily in improving their infrastructure and in implementing CRM systems to give them a single view of the customer. For organizations that are having to repair their reputations, and this comes from much analysis and research that's been done in both utilities and financial services, then it can take 3 to 5 years to repair your reputation. And one of the things that we'll see is that reputational issues have a dampening effect on all other customer metrics. So we tend to see lower NPS scores and lower CSAT scores. Now, concurrently with this, organizations can start to build the infrastructure that creates a great experience for customers. But we need to modify the expectations here. Most people seem to think we can jump straight to the answer, and if we just ask our people to treat customers more nicely, that'll fix things. It doesn't, of course, because it's a little bit like building the roof before you put the foundations in. So building the experience, putting the infrastructure in place to create an experience is what happens next. And then finally, there is something, a tipping point is reached where all of these aspects come together, and the customer palpably feels a change in the quality of the experience that they're receiving. And we'll look a little bit more as to what those crystallizing events might look like. So let's move on to look at the NPS curve, or the NPS chart, really, and talk about the logical sequence for implementing the 6 pillars. So based on our analysis, those 3 phases are important, but we can subdivide those into sort of how you would sequence the implementation of the 6 key pillars. So if we look at the score on NPS between 0 and 4, typically what we see in there tends to be integrity issues, either at the macro level, so, industry stereotyping or problems with the industry, or at the micro level, which is, does the organization deliver on what it says it should be delivering on? In terms of sort of 4 and 5, or even 4, 5, and 6, really, on the NPS line, then resolution. So when things go wrong, how well do we put those right? How well do we fix things? And do we leave the customer feeling good about it? 6 and 7 tend to be issues relating to expectations and time and effort. Now, what's interesting here is that if you deliver a good quality customer experience, the chances are the customer will give you a rating of 6 or 7. It's got to do something more than that if you're going to create promoters. So moving to sort of an 8, 9, or 10 requires a focus on empathy, so how you treat customers. So Air New Zealand made a significant leap forward when they talked about how they bring essential Kiwiness, as they describe it, alive for their customers. But it wasn't until they brought that through their safety videos, their food, all the different aspects of the experience that they started to see their customers move into 9 and 10. So the empathy and personalization being some of the key factors, really, that drive a much higher score. And the tendency and the desire, really, is to go straight to the answer, to go straight to empathy, straight to personalization. But unless you go through the first 4 stages, then that may well be superfluous activity, and you may well not see the dial move. So let me talk about Florida Power and Light very quickly. So Florida Power and Light, reputational issues. So 2005, a particularly bad year for them after Hurricane Wilma. A large number of their customers lost power for an entire week, and this led them to respond with a sort of fairly extensive investment program. So $1 billion over 3 years, burying cables, making their sort of infrastructure hurricane resilient, and also looking at emergency services and making sure that those emergency services were protected in the event of weather events. But also, and simultaneous with this, they went through a fairly extensive reputation recovery program. So they introduced the Solar Lab, finding really good and innovative ways that they could reduce costs of power provision to their customers. They provided free solar panels to every school in Florida, started to rebuild the reputation at a local level. They emphasized wildlife and the efforts they were making to preserve indigenous Florida wildlife, and they also focused on what they needed to do for the customer. Now, alongside all of that, they realized that this multifaceted approach needed to be harnessed and needed to be developed as a concerted whole. So they identified what they call the 3 Cs. The first was concern for customers. Second was the customer reputation. And third was credibility. These were the 3 things that for them were going to move them and move the dial and help them move forward. They also internally wanted to ensure that they exhibited a level of dedication to making the change, whilst at the same time building on their environmental and community involvement that we talked about before. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, it shows the size of the prize. So this is an analysis based on switching cost. So on the vertical axis, you'll see that the amount that a bill would have to be reduced for the customer to change provider. And on the horizontal axis, you can see the level of trust that an individual has in the company. 0 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. And you can see that when we look at a 9 or a 10, what customers have said is if they score the company that highly, then they would need to have a 30% reduction from a competitor to switch providers. So the power, if you will, of the building trust, driving through the 6 pillars, reflects itself in terms of retention and loyalty and barriers to people or customers going elsewhere. So in terms of moving forward and what is the crystallizing event? What is the thing that sort of makes a difference? Well, the investment continued, so $800 million invested in the smart network, 4.5 million smart meters rolled out. part of the technology involved in the smart meters was able to identify and solve power outages. So in Florida, key issue, was it something that the householder had done, or was it something that was a problem with the infrastructure? And being able to locate that improved satisfaction because they were able to talk to the householder and explain what they needed to do to restore power if the issue was on their side of the equation. But what they did very cleverly was move the emphasis from price to cost. So all of this knowledge, all of this technology allowed them to equip the householder with a very clear view, simply portrayed, as to what the householder needed to do to get their costs down. And they moved the emphasis, I suppose, in the householder's mind from it's a utility that I pay a price to being I am in charge of managing my costs, and I have been equipped with all the information that I need to get my costs down. And that transition made a significant impact on the mindsets, really, of their users, and made a significant difference in terms of how they rated their relationship with Florida and Power & Light. And as a consequence, we saw them jump up the league tables to number 36 in total. So what does this mean in terms of profit? Well, at the end of the day, all of this work is fine, but actually does it result in a commercial outcome that's beneficial to the business? You can see that really Florida Power & Light's profitability has jumped enormously, 300%. So as a consequence of getting all of those factors right, which you can see on the left-hand side, so each of the 6 pillars, you can see how they've all jumped forward, with integrity being one of the most significant. But in terms of the performance of the business, a massive leap and a massive improvement in profitability as a consequence. So let me now hand over to David. Before I do, if you are interested in 3 areas, really, just to point you to the Nunwood website. So other analysis like this is available on the website, so experience diagnostics, some views on customer journey mapping and how that might be undertaken, but also other best-in-class sort of management activities that have gone on, then please go to the Nunwood website and you'll find plenty more information that you may find helpful. So let me now hand over to David, who's going to talk about, well, if that's the future, if Florida Power & Light shows the way, then what are the things that we would need to do as a utility to move us in that direction?
Thank you, David. So let me talk about 4 drivers of future direction in utilities that I think will affect customer service. And you see them on this slide. The first driver is the well-known policy trilemma. So the first element of that, of course, is energy security. And energy security is primarily, of course, about keeping the lights on for customers. And this will include finding and investing in new sources of energy and new generation assets. It will also include demand-side reduction and perhaps getting some larger customers to switch consumption to off-peak hours, sometimes called load shifting. The second element, of course, is low carbonisation. And the UK has legal commitments regarding CO2 emission reduction, and so more renewable energy will come on stream to meet those commitments. And for some customers, associating their energy with green sources will be, for some, increasingly important. And the third element of the trilemma, of course, is affordability. This has become a very big political issue. Customers are also voters. And in many other sectors, customers have come to expect that prices will go down over time, but energy bills have continued to go up over time. And we know that Ed Miliband famously promised to break up the Big Six, even more famously promised to freeze energy prices in response to this issue. And the whole sector was referred to the competition authorities because of this issue. And we know that energy bills are not well understood. And coupled with poor response times in utilities compared to some other sectors, trust is fragile at best, and restoring and maintaining trust will be a very high priority in future in this sector. So the second driver is regulatory pressure, and I've specifically put on the slide the CMA review. Chris referred to this briefly a moment or two ago. I won't go over the whole of this Tuesday's provisional recommendations from the Competition and Markets Authority. It's interesting to just note in passing that overall the CMA found no significant evidence of profiteering, which is one of the main allegations when the referral was made. But instead they have found evidence of what they've called sticky customers. customers who don't engage with their energy suppliers, who have never switched and so are on higher tariffs as a result. And putting such customers on a default tariff is one of the provisional recommendations of the CMA. The practical details on this are a bit thin at this stage as to how you would actually do that and what it would mean. Also, doing away with Ofgem's limit of 4 tariffs is another possible recommendation. But the underlying issue is one of disengaged customers losing out. That's what the CMA have pointed at. And the regulatory pressure seems to be for companies to engage more with customers who don't want to engage. Now, there is an interesting challenge, and that's going to be something that the energy companies will have to wrestle with moving forward. The third driver is technology. New energy sources will include energy produced by customers, for example, solar panels and wind turbines. And some customers' experience of their energy supplier will in future be affected by how this shifting customer behavior is handled by the energy supplier themselves. A few customers might even reach the state of being wholly independent. But surely there are likely still to be network charges charged to the customer, and handling these will be an interesting customer engagement challenge for the energy suppliers. Technology will help reduce operating costs, and KPMG has a number of technologies which are, for example, focused on reducing the operating costs of managing field forces of service engineers or smart meter installers, and I'll mention a case study in that area in a moment. But technology will also have a role to enable better customer intimacy and understanding customer behavior better and intervening or contacting customers at key moments of truth. And David has illustrated this when referring to Florida Power and Light a few moments ago in their communication with customers during power outages and helping customers to get their costs down. The fourth driver I want to mention is data. Everybody knows that utilities have large customer databases, so there's lots of data, and smart meters will give us more data. But how do you discern the meaningful signal from all the other noise? How do you determine cause and effect and the interrelatedness of meaningful signals? And what decisions do energy companies need to take that can be better made as a result of the better use of data and data science? Well, here are some of them, and I think that the energy companies and the utilities are thinking these questions through right now, but here are some of them. Is the timing right for the customer? What is the customer's propensity to buy or to switch? Of the many hats that this customer wears, which hat is on now? Is there an upcoming compelling event which will motivate this customer to do X, Y, or Z? And some other decisions that can be better made by the better use of data are less obviously about customer intimacy and customer engagement, but I think they are related. They can be about operational excellence and reliability. So data which makes asset management cheaper and more effective helps deliver the dual benefits for customers of affordability and security supply. Data which leads to better decisions about field force optimization leads to affordability benefits for customers, as well as potentially low carbonization if, as in the case of Florida Power and Light, if the interaction between the smart meter installer and the customer leaves the customer better able to manage their own energy consumption. And so for a good while yet into the future, companies will be working out how best to use data science to better understand their customers' behaviors. Now let me just give you a quick case study from another sector. This is from one of the largest installers of satellite TV dishes in the US. And it's about managing the field force and enabling them to give the customer an enhanced experience whilst the installer is in the customer's home. And its applicability to utilities is, I think, clear. So through handheld devices, the field engineer coming to install a satellite dish is supported on a very timely basis with their technical tasks, but also the engineer is supported with the customer interaction, which is supported by prompts and aids on the handheld device. The tool used is a tool developed by a team of developers recently acquired by KPMG, so we would think of this as being a KPMG tool. The satellite dish installation company, we could think of them as a smart meter installer or a boiler servicing company in our own sector, in the utility sector. But the company first analyzes and understands their own field force individually and individually allocates them. Each individual engineer is allocated to a particular persona. And the personas range, you can see them on this slide, I'm not going to go through them all, but the personas range from, in the top right, the highly technical, competent and skilled communicator ninja, down to the bottom left-hand corner, the high-anxiety new hire, who has little experience of doing the technical installation and so lacks any real confidence when talking to the customer. And the tool captures the typical thoughts, feelings and behaviours of each persona, and so provides the sorts of guidance and reminders that this particular person will most likely need at each stage of the workflow, including in relation to speaking to the customer. For example, calling ahead to say that he's on his way and he'll be there in 15 minutes, perhaps being one of the most obvious. But the tool includes reinforcement and learning techniques and takes each person on an on-the-job development journey, which hopefully results in a ninja destination for all engineers. And that journey can include prompts that are specifically about customer engagement and customer experience. So prompting the engineer as to, does the customer need to know something at this point? Have you asked the customer whether they understand how the dish, or in our case perhaps the meter, works? Does the customer have any questions about the control panel? Ask the customer to complete a short questionnaire perhaps at this stage on your handheld device before you leave, or some other form of pulse survey. And the business outcomes from this enabling field force support tool during the workflow are seen on the following slide, actually. So you've got a reduced number of rescheduled visits. You've got reduced calls from the customer to the call center for whom the engineer has left, but they haven't quite understood what the messages were. You've got increased one-time visits where the whole thing is dealt with in one successful visit. You've got increased customer satisfaction. The experience of dealing with the installer was a good one. And you've also got increased employee satisfaction and retention because the engineer is being trained and feels that he's making a contribution to customer satisfaction. The point of including this case study is to show that the tool is not only about productivity, though it is about that. It's also about the customer being at the center of the supplier's thinking and realizing that the human contact that your customer is most likely to have is with a task-focused technical engineer who has not, over the last 5 or 20 years, had much coaching and support in customer service. And that case study seems to me to have lots of relevance in utilities, where there is still a whole smart meter rollout ahead of us, and more services are being provided by service engineers. And at KPMG, we think that we will see utilities making greater strides in serving customers better and achieving great customer engagement and trust by these sorts of tools and addressing those 4 drivers I mentioned earlier. Thanks very much. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, David. So there's an awful lot there to think about and consider, and by way of a sort of wash-up or summary of the overall message or the essential messages that we'd like to pose at this stage, we thought of really these 4 statements, but perhaps questions is a better way of posing them. How do we get there? Well, promoting customer experience presence on the board of utilities and energy companies is a fairly obvious finding or conclusion. And the way I'd like to think about that is posing the question, how can customer experience professionals, customer-facing professionals and operations professionals work together to see the customer experience as being an essential tenet of the overall business strategy? Focus on customer data that delivers real value. David's illustration there of information assets and information tools and techniques that do that, often termed sort of lean, follow that lean principle of maximizing those things that add value to the customer and minimizing those things that don't, or eradicating those things that don't add value to the customer, is a question that has to be constantly addressed and answered. Communicating and cascading customer experience insights to deliver commercial value and return. I think there's a huge difference between the wealth of insight and information assets that organizations tend to generate in our experience and the actionable insights that they tend to be able to focus on, to deliver, and to present in a way which can be consistently delivered and executed to the business in an agile and effective way. And finally, accelerating customer knowledge through technology. Again, some of the case studies that we've seen here, but also the way in which information about the customer's response, about the customer's perceptions, about the customer's needs and wants is visualized, presented, made actionable, made accessible to the key commercial, operational, and other decision-making positions within the organization. So that's the main part of today's webinar, and I think we're going to have a pause now for questions and answers. I'll hand back to David.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in now, and we'll do our very best to answer them. We've had a few questions already, so let me just deal with those. So the first is, will the slides be made available? And the answer is yes, they will. You'll be able to download those from our website, which is www.nunwood.com. If you go there, you'll be able to get not just the slides, but the other information that we've talked about as well. Another question is the degree to which the examples that we gave, so organizations like Nationwide and Air New Zealand, the degree to which that was a kind of one-off blip versus it was that, did it just appear once in the survey? And the answer to that is no. In actual fact, we've seen both of those organizations continue to climb. So both Nationwide and Air New Zealand continue to improve. And I think one of the points that we would make, if you approach this in the right sequence, then it's a sustainable platform which you can build and move forward, as opposed to a one-off improvement that dissipates over time. So please send in any questions that you may have. One other question which I'm going to address to David is, you talked very engagingly there, David, about the types of technology that organizations are looking at. Where would you say the biggest impact might be made in terms of technologies today for utilities looking to improve customer intimacy? Where are the opportunities that these organizations have?
I think probably going back to your pillars, it must be around the personalization and trying to develop a sort of a conversation almost with individual customers, and picking up something that Chris was saying earlier as well about putting the customer in control. And I think that those elements of people feeling that they don't really know what their energy bill represents, and they're not quite sure why it is the number that it is. And of course, we don't really have a wide coverage of smart meters yet in the UK. I was in the US last month talking to a utility who, every week they sent their customers details of what they had spent the week before, with recommendations as to how they could reduce their consumption for the following week. Well, I was listening to that and thinking that's a tremendously personalised, relevant, putting me in control service, which for the most part we can't provide in the UK at the moment because we don't have that coverage of smart meters that type of proposition and service would require. So I think that personalisation is probably the key. Putting people in control of their energy consumption, giving them proactive recommendations for reducing their consumption, and also just greater transparency around what are the the drivers of cost in their bill, which I don't think most customers would understand. So there's a lot of, on the customer side, I think there's a lot of technology around operational efficiency as well, which leads on to affordability, which customers will appreciate. But I think personalisation is probably the answer to your question.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And one for Chris, which is coming. Chris, one of the questions is, is this the year, 2015, 2016, given all the investment and all the activity that's going into improving the quality of the customer experience across utilities, is this the year where we'll start to see them moving forward and maybe reversing the position that we saw in last year's survey?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I wish I had a crystal ball and really knew. All the signs are that we're seeing and observing on the ground that there is an increased interest in experience, customer intimacy, customer assets, and coupled with the environmental and technology changes that we talked about through the course of the webinar, the pressure seems to be building, and peer pressure is often a huge influencer of strategic direction within a sector, and also, as the study shows, from pressure outside of a sector. So we think the signs are that the utility sector is very well positioned to move forward, to take advantage of its unique ability to manage that information relationship through some of the technologies that are coming through in the sector, and focus on customer in a way that doesn't appear to have been so apparent in the results of previous surveys in previous years.
Great stuff. Thank you, Chris. I think it's interesting to just listening to Chris's answer there that this could be the opportunity to move forward significantly, given the amount of activity that's going on across utilities at the moment, and we'll see shortly. So, the 2015 UK survey is currently in field, and the results of that will be published in early September. So we'll have some insight then as to what progress has been made over the year at that time. Right. I think in terms of questions, we're probably coming to the end, and probably in terms of time, there are a few other questions that are coming in. So what we'll do is we'll email a response to those questions directly to the individuals that submit them. So it just remains to me to thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found it useful. Further information available from nunwood.com. And thank you very much for your attention.